Visualize yourself standing on a windswept moor where time seems suspended between earth and sky. The year could be any year before written memory began, when this land was known simply as home to those who called it theirs. Long before the Romans coined the name Caledonia, before Christianity crossed the seas, before kings wore crowns of gold, there lived a people whose very bones would become part of Scotland's foundation. These weren't the Celts of romantic imagination, draped in mystical robes and wielding magical powers. They were farmers, hunters, craftspeople who understood that survival meant reading the sky for weather, the ground for crops, and the faces of neighbors for trust or treachery. Their settlements clung to hilltops, not from choice, but from necessity. Height meant safety. Stone meant permanence. The Brock Towers, that still dot the northern landscape, tell us stories without words. These hollow stone cylinders, rising like ancient lighthouses from the moors, housed entire communities. Families slept in galleries built into thick walls. Grain was stored in chambers that stayed cool through summer's heat. Livestock sheltered in the central courtyard when winter storms howled across the islands. Consider the engineering genius required to build these structures without mortar, each stone carefully shaped and fitted so precisely that centuries of Atlantic gales couldn't topple them. The builders possessed knowledge we're only beginning to understand. They knew which stones would bear weight, how to channel wind around curved walls, where to place narrow windows that would let in light while keeping out arrows. Within these stone sanctuaries, life followed rhythms older than memory. Women ground barley between stones worn smooth by generations of hands. Men repaired fishing nets, while children listened to stories that carried the weight of ancestral wisdom. The elderly, repositories of tribal knowledge, passed down techniques for reading weather patterns, identifying edible plants, and negotiating with neighboring clans. Religion wasn't separate from daily existence, but woven through every action. Sacred groves marked boundaries between territories. Standing stones, arranged in circles that aligned with celestial movements, served as calendars and temples simultaneously. The Druids who tended these sites weren't otherworldly mystics, but practical leaders who understood astronomy, medicine, and law. Warfare, when it came, was intensely personal. Raiders might steal cattle, the primary measure of wealth, but they did so knowing that retribution would follow. Honor demanded response to insult. Blood called for blood. Yet the same communities that could fight savagely over stolen livestock would welcome strangers with elaborate hospitality, sharing their best food and warmest sleeping places. Trade networks stretched far beyond what might seem possible for such seemingly isolated communities. Amber from the Baltic, copper from Ireland, and even silk from distant Asia found their way to northern Scotland. In exchange went wool and cloth, silver jewelry, and trained hunting hounds prized throughout the Celtic world. The sea wasn't a barrier, but a highway. Skin boats carried traders between islands, following navigation techniques passed down through oral tradition. Currents, bird flights, and the color of distant clouds all served as signposts for mariners who could find their way through fog-shrouded channels that would confound modern sailors. When autumn approached, entire communities would move to winter settlements. Following ancient patterns of transhumance, cattle were driven to protected valleys, grain was ground and stored, tools were repaired, and weapons sharpened. The long dark months ahead required preparation that began with summer's first harvest. Death, when it came, was neither feared nor celebrated, but accepted as part of the natural order. Bodies were buried with tools, jewelry, and food for whatever journey lay ahead. Some were laid in stone cists marked by standing stones. Others were placed in chambered cairns where generations of ancestors already rested. These pre-Roman inhabitants left no written chronicles, coined no money, built no cities in the sense that civilized peoples understand cities. Yet their legacy runs deeper than political history. They established settlement patterns that would endure for millennia. They developed agricultural techniques suited to Scotland's harsh climate. They created artistic traditions that would influence later generations of craftspeople. Their blood flows in modern Scottish veins. Their stories, transformed by countless retellings, still echo in Highland ballads. Their understanding of the land's moods and seasons remains embedded in rural communities across Scotland. They were the first Scots, though they never called themselves by that name. Transport yourself to the year 79 AD, standing alongside Roman scouts as they gaze across the River Forth into territory no southern army has ever claimed. Behind you marched the disciplined legions of Agricola, their bronze armor gleaming, their standards bearing the symbols of an empire that has conquered most of the known world. Ahead lies Caledonia, a land that will test Roman military might against Celtic determination. The invasion began with typical Roman efficiency. Roads were surveyed and constructed, cutting straight lines through ancient hunting grounds. Forts rose at strategic intervals, each one a miniature Rome complete with heated baths, granaries, and workshops. The message was clear. Rome intended to stay, yet Caledonia refused to yield as easily as Gaul or Britain's southern kingdoms. The terrain itself seemed to resist Roman engineering. Bogs swallowed entire supply trains. Mountain passes became killing grounds, where painted warriors could strike and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Dense forests provided endless hiding places for enemies who fought by rules no Roman manual described. Agricola pushed northward methodically, establishing a chain of temporary camps that archaeologists still uncover today. Each site tells the same story: Roman discipline meeting Celtic fury. The legionaries, accustomed to fighting conventional armies on open battlefields, found themselves facing an enemy that appeared from mist-shrouded glens, struck with devastating speed, then melted back into landscape they knew intimately. The culmination came at Mons Graupius, a battle whose location remains debated, but whose significance is undeniable. Here, according to the historian Tacitus, 30,000 Caledonians gathered under a leader named Calgacus. The speech Tacitus attributes to this Celtic chieftain before battle rings with defiant eloquence. They make a desert and call it peace. The battle itself followed predictable patterns. Roman discipline and superior equipment ultimately prevailed over Celtic courage and intimate knowledge of terrain. Thousands of warriors fell, their bronze swords no match for Roman steel, their individual bravery insufficient against coordinated military tactics refined through centuries of conquest. Yet victory proved hollow. Agricola was recalled to Rome before he could consolidate his gains. The northern tribes, bloodied but not broken, resumed their resistance. Roman outposts found themselves isolated, constantly harassed, supplied only at enormous cost and risk. The withdrawal, when it came, was presented as strategic redeployment. Legions were needed elsewhere in the empire. The northern territories were deemed too costly to hold for too little gain. But the truth was simpler. Rome had met its match in the Scottish Highlands. Hadrian, when he became emperor, chose a different approach. Instead of endless campaigns to subdue the unconquerable, he would build a wall, not just any wall, but a monument to Roman engineering that would define the northern limit of civilization itself. Construction began in 122 AD, employing thousands of soldiers and civilian workers. The wall stretched from the Solway Firth to the River Tyne, a distance of 73 miles. But this wasn't merely a barrier of stone and turf. It was a complex military installation complete with forts, mile castles, turrets, and a military road running its entire length. The wall's builders came from across the empire. Auxiliary units from Syria, Germany, and North Africa left inscriptions in their native languages. Some complained about the cold and rain. Others boasted of their construction achievements. Many never returned home, buried in cemeteries that still yield evidence of their diverse origins. life along the wall developed its own rhythms. Soldiers married local women, despite regulations forbidding such unions. Children grew up bilingual, equally comfortable with Latin and local dialects. Markets flourished around major forts, selling everything from imported wine to locally made pottery. North of the wall, the unconquered tribes watched and waited. They had learned valuable lessons from their encounters with Roman military might. Warfare became more sophisticated, incorporating tactics observed during decades of conflict. Metalworking improved, producing weapons that could match Roman quality, if not quantity. Trade continued, despite political hostilities. Roman goods found their way north through unofficial channels. Scottish cattle and hides moved south to supply Roman markets. The wall, intended as an absolute barrier, became instead a permeable membrane through which goods, ideas, and people flowed in both directions. The Antonine Wall, built farther north during the 140s, represented Rome's final attempt to extend direct control into Scotland. Constructed of turf rather than stone, running from the Forth to the Clyde, it lasted barely 20 years before being abandoned. The ruins remain today as testimony to ambition defeated by reality. When Roman power finally withdrew from Britain entirely in the early 5th century, Scotland remained what it had always been, unconquered, independent, shaped by its own choices rather than imperial decree. The legacy of Rome's northern failure would echo through Scottish consciousness for centuries, reinforcing beliefs about Highland invincibility that would inspire resistance to later invaders. The stones of Hadrian's Wall still stand, weathered but unbroken, marking the northern limit of an empire that spanned 3 continents. They remind us that even the mightiest military machine can be stopped by determined people fighting for their homeland. Step into the realm of mystery that surrounded Scotland's most enigmatic inhabitants, the people the Romans feared enough to build walls against. These weren't simply barbaric tribes painted with blue woad, as popular imagination suggests, but sophisticated societies with complex political structures, advanced metalworking skills, and artistic traditions that produced some of medieval Europe's most intricate stone carvings. The Picts, as Romans named them, called themselves something entirely different. Their true name, along with most of their language, vanished when their kingdom merged with that of their Gaelic neighbours. What remains are tantalizing fragments, place names ending in Pit and Aber, personal names preserved in chronicles, and most mysteriously, the symbol stones that dot northeastern Scotland like ancient puzzles waiting to be solved. These symbol stones represent one of archaeology's greatest enigmas. Carved with precision that speaks of specialized craftsmen, they display a consistent repertoire of images, abstract symbols, animals both real and fantastic, mirrors, combs, and hunting scenes. Some stones stand alone in forgotten corners of farmland. Others guard churchyards or mark ancient burial grounds. Their purpose remains debated, but their sophistication is undeniable. Pictish society was far more complex than Roman chronicles suggest. Archaeological evidence reveals networks of hill forts connected by trackways, centers of metalworking that produce jewelry equal to anything found elsewhere in Europe, and agricultural systems that supported substantial populations. Their kings weren't petty chieftains, but rulers who could mobilize armies capable of defeating Roman legions. The royal succession system particularly puzzled outsiders. Unlike most medieval societies, the Picts traced royal descent through the female line. Kings were succeeded not by their sons, but by their nephews, the sons of their sisters. This matrilineal system ensured that royal blood remained pure, while preventing the kingdom from fragmenting into rival dynasties. Pictish warriors were renowned throughout northern Europe for their fighting skills. They developed distinctive weapons, curved swords suited to their fighting style, elaborate shields decorated with metal work, and throwing spears that could penetrate Roman armor. Their horses, bred from stock that may have originated in Germanic lands, were smaller than modern breeds, but perfectly adapted to highland terrain. The Picts were also master shipbuilders. Their vessels, constructed without iron nails, using sophisticated joinery techniques, could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. These ships carried raiders to distant shores, but also facilitated trade networks that stretched from Ireland to Scandinavia. Pictish merchants were known in Baltic markets, and Baltic amber has been found in Pictish graves. Their settlements reflected both practical needs and sophisticated planning. Major centres like Dunid in Argyll or the Moat of Mark in Dumfries were more than simple fortifications. They were complex sites with specialised areas for different crafts: bronze working, jewellery making, textile production, and food preparation. Evidence suggests these centres hosted seasonal gatherings where scattered communities came together for trade, religious ceremonies, and political negotiations. Religion among the Picts blended ancient traditions with newer influences. Sacred groves and stone circles continued to play important roles in ritual life, but Christianity also made early inroads. Some of the most beautiful early Christian art in Britain was produced in Pictish workshops, including the magnificent St Andrew's sarcophagus and illuminated manuscripts that rival the Book of Kells. The Pictish language, sadly lost to history, was apparently Celtic, but distinct from both Welsh and Gaelic branches. Linguistic analysis of place names and personal names preserved in later chronicles suggests it may have been related to ancient British languages spoken throughout Celtic Britain before the Roman conquest. Its loss represents one of history's most significant linguistic extinctions. Women held unusually prominent positions in Pictish society. Beyond the royal succession system, there's evidence of female craftspeople, religious leaders, and even military commanders. The symbol stones include depictions of women in positions of authority, suggesting that Pictish society was less rigidly patriarchal than most contemporary cultures. The transition from independence to integration with the Kingdom of the Scots wasn't a sudden conquest, but a gradual process, spanning several generations. Intermarriage between royal families, shared threats from Viking raiders, and increasing Christian influence all contributed to the eventual merger that would create the Kingdom of Alb. Kenneth MacAlpin, traditionally credited with uniting Picts and Scots, probably represented the culmination of this long process rather than its beginning. His achievement was to formalize and stabilize relationships that had been developing for decades. The Pictish kingdom didn't disappear overnight, but was gradually absorbed into the larger Gaelic-speaking realm, yet traces of Pictish culture persisted long after political independence ended. Sculptural traditions influenced later medieval art. Place names preserved ancient linguistic patterns. Agricultural techniques developed over centuries of highland farming continued to shape rural life. Most significantly, the fierce independence that characterized Pictish resistance to Roman conquest became part of Scottish national character. The painted warriors may have vanished from history, but their legacy lives on in the landscape they shaped, the monuments they created, and the indomitable spirit they passed to their descendants. Drift with your mind across the grey waters of the Inner Hebrides to a small, windswept island where one of history's most consequential journeys reached its destination. Iona in the year 563 was nothing more than a rocky outcrop barely 3 miles long, home to seabirds and seals. Yet this humble island was destined to become the spiritual heart of Scotland, the place where ancient Celtic traditions would merge with Christian faith to create something entirely new. Columba, the Irish monk who stepped ashore that spring day, carried with him far more than the simple belongings of a religious exile. He brought literacy to a largely oral culture, architectural knowledge that would transform stone building techniques, and most importantly, a vision of faith that could adapt to Highland customs rather than simply replacing them. The monastery that rose on Iona reflected this synthesis of traditions, built from local stone in techniques learned from generations of Baroque construction. It incorporated Christian symbolism with Celtic artistic motifs. The high crosses that still guard the island's ancient burial grounds represent one of medieval Europe's finest expressions of religious art. Their intricate carvings telling biblical stories in visual languages that illiterate converts could understand. Life within the monastery followed rhythms that would have seemed familiar to pre-Christian communities. Monks rose before dawn for prayers that coincided with ancient Celtic observations of celestial movements. They worked in fields using agricultural methods developed over centuries of highland farming. They crafted jewelry and metalwork using traditional techniques but decorating their creations with Christian symbols. The scriptorium, where monks laboriously copied manuscripts, represented a revolution in Highland culture. For the first time, oral traditions could be preserved permanently. Laws could be written down and standardized. Historical chronicles could record events for future generations. The written word, previously unknown in most of Scotland, became a tool for both spiritual instruction and political administration. Columba's missionary journeys took him throughout western Scotland, from the Hebrides to the Great Glen. Unlike many Christian evangelists who demanded complete abandonment of traditional practices, he skillfully adapted Christian teaching to Highland customs. Sacred groves became sites for Christian worship. Ancient festivals were transformed into celebrations of saints' days. Traditional songs acquired new verses praising Christian virtues. The conversion of Brude, king of the Northern Picts, represented Columba's greatest diplomatic triumph. The journey to Brude's fortress, near present-day Inverness, required crossing territories controlled by potentially hostile clans, navigating treacherous waters, and ultimately confronting a powerful ruler who had reason to view Christian missionaries with suspicion. Contemporary accounts describe supernatural events surrounding this meeting. Locked doors opening at Columba's approach, druids unable to match his miraculous powers, even the taming of a great beast in nearby waters. Whether these represent literal truth or symbolic descriptions of Christianity's triumph over paganism, they illustrate the profound impact of Columba's mission on Highland imagination. The monastic network that spread from Iona created Scotland's first educational system. Young men from clan families came to monasteries not only for religious instruction, but to learn reading, writing, mathematics, and music. These monastery schools produced the first generation of native Scottish scholars who could correspond with learned men throughout Christianized Europe. Women's religious communities also flourished, though less evidence of their activities survives. Abbesses ruled double monasteries that housed both men and women, managing substantial properties and wielding considerable political influence. These institutions provided alternatives to marriage and motherhood for women of aristocratic families, while creating centers of learning where female scholars could pursue intellectual work. The artistic achievements of early Scottish Christianity rival anything produced elsewhere in medieval Europe. The Ruthwell Cross, the St. Andrew's sarcophagus, and the magnificent high crosses of Iona demonstrate mastery of stone carving that combine Germanic, interlaced patterns with Mediterranean, Christian imagery, and distinctively Celtic artistic sensibilities. Manuscript illumination reached extraordinary heights in Scottish monasteries. The Book of Kells, possibly created on Iona before being moved to Ireland for safekeeping, represents one of medieval Europe's artistic pinnacles. Its intricate designs, brilliant colors, and complex symbolism required years of work by master craftsmen using techniques passed down through generations of Highland artisans. The intellectual life of Scottish monasteries attracted scholars from across Europe. Students came from as far as Germany and Italy to study in Highland institutions, renowned for their libraries and learned habits. Scottish monks, in turn, carried their educational traditions to continental Europe, establishing important monasteries in Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. Viking raids of the 9th century disrupted, but didn't destroy this monastic culture. Monasteries developed defensive strategies, hiding precious manuscripts, burying valuable metalwork, maintaining boats ready for evacuation to inland refuges. Some communities relocated permanently to safer locations, but the basic structure of Scottish Christianity proved resilient enough to survive political turmoil. The legacy of Columba's mission extended far beyond religious conversion. Scottish monasteries preserved and transmitted classical learning during the Dark Ages. They created artistic traditions that influenced European medieval art. They established educational systems that produced Scotland's first generation of literate administrators and diplomats. Most significantly, they created a distinctively Scottish form of Christianity that retained Highland cultural characteristics while connecting Scotland to the broader Christian world. Feel the salt spray on your face as you stand on a Hebridean shore in the year 794, watching the horizon where dark shapes emerge from morning mist. Those aren't fishing boats returning with the day's catch, but longships with carved dragon heads and striped sails, carrying men whose very names would become synonymous with terror throughout the Christian world. The Vikings had arrived in Scotland, and nothing would ever be the same. The first raid struck like lightning from a clear sky. Monasteries, with their accumulated wealth and defenseless communities, offered irresistible targets. Iona, the spiritual heart of Scottish Christianity, suffered repeated attacks that left buildings burned and treasures scattered. Yet these weren't random acts of barbarian destruction, but carefully planned operations conducted by experienced maritime warriors who understood exactly what they sought. Norse society produced these raiders through economic necessity and cultural opportunity. Scandinavia's population had outgrown its agricultural capacity, just as shipbuilding techniques reached new levels of sophistication. The longship, shallow-drafted and swift, could navigate both open seas and narrow rivers, carrying war bands to targets that had never imagined attack from the water. But the Vikings who came to Scotland weren't merely raiders seeking quick plunder. Many arrived as settlers, bringing families, livestock, and agricultural tools. The northern Isles, the Orkney and Shetland, became so thoroughly Norse that they remained politically connected to Norway for another 6 centuries. Archaeological evidence reveals complete cultural transformation. Norse farmsteads replaced Celtic settlements. Scandinavian place names obliterated earlier linguistic patterns, and even burial practices changed to reflect new religious beliefs. The settlement patterns that emerged tell fascinating stories of cultural adaptation. Norse farmers discovered that Highland cattle breeds, developed over centuries to survive harsh winters, were superior to Scandinavian stock. They adopted Celtic agricultural techniques while introducing new crops and farming methods. The result was a hybrid culture that was neither purely Norse nor purely Celtic, but something entirely new. Orkney became the center of a Norse earldom that wielded enormous influence throughout the North Atlantic world. The Earls of Orkney weren't mere provincial administrators, but independent rulers who commanded fleets capable of intervening in conflicts from Ireland to Iceland. Their sagas, preserved in medieval Icelandic manuscripts, describe adventures that span the known world and beyond. The Orkneyinga saga preserves detailed accounts of these Norse rulers and their achievements. Earl Sigurd the Stout died at the Battle of Clontarf, fighting alongside Brian Boru against rival Irish kings. Earl Thorfinn the Mighty controlled territory from Shetland to the River Oikel, ruling domains larger than many European kingdoms. These weren't petty chieftains, but significant political figures whose actions influenced the course of Northern European history. Norse influence extended far beyond the islands where they settled most densely. The western seaboard, from the Hebrides to the Clyde, became part of a maritime cultural zone where Gaelic and Norse traditions merged. The Lords of the Isles, who would later challenge the authority of Scottish kings, traced their origins to this hybrid culture that valued seamanship, warrior prowess, and political independence above territorial boundaries. The impact on warfare was revolutionary. Pre-Viking Scottish combat had been largely land-based, focused on cattle raiding and territorial disputes between neighboring clans. Norse military culture introduced concepts of professional warfare, naval tactics, and military engineering that transformed Highland fighting methods. Scottish warriors began adopting Viking weapons, armor designs, and battle formations. Trade networks established by Viking merchants connected Scotland to markets throughout Northern Europe and beyond. Amber from the Baltic, silver from the Islamic world, and exotic goods from Byzantium found their way to Highland settlements. In exchange, Scotland exported furs, walrus ivory from the Northern Islands, and increasingly, slaves captured in raids against neighboring territories. The religious implications of Norse settlement were complex and long-lasting. While many Vikings eventually converted to Christianity, they brought with them mythological traditions that influenced Scottish folklore for centuries. Stories of berserkers, sea monsters, and supernatural islands became integrated into Highland oral tradition. Place names throughout northern Scotland preserve references to Norse gods and mythological figures. Norse legal traditions also left permanent marks on Scottish jurisprudence. The concept of the Thing or assembly, where free men could voice opinions and influence decisions, became part of Highland political culture. Norse inheritance laws, which recognized women's rights to property ownership, influenced later Scottish legal developments. The idea that law should be publicly declared and democratically debated represented a significant departure from earlier Celtic practices. The gradual integration of Norse and Gaelic cultures produced artistic achievements of extraordinary beauty and complexity. Norse metalworking techniques combined with Celtic decorative traditions to create jewelry and weapons that are among medieval Europe's finest artistic productions. The St. Ninian's Old Treasure, discovered in Shetland, demonstrates the sophistication of this hybrid artistic culture. Perhaps most significantly, Viking settlement patterns established territorial divisions that would influence Scottish political geography for centuries. The Western Isles became culturally distinct from both Highland and Lowland Scotland, maintaining semi-independent status under the Lords of the Isles until the late medieval period. This cultural and political fragmentation would repeatedly challenge attempts to create unified Scottish kingdoms. When the age of Viking expansion finally ended, Scotland had been permanently transformed. Norse settlers hadn't simply raided and departed, but had become integral parts of Scottish society. Their descendants would fight in Scottish armies, serve Scottish kings, and help define what it meant to be Scottish. The dragons that had crossed the sea carried more than weapons and warriors. They brought cultural innovations that enriched Scottish civilization in ways that continue to resonate today. Stand witness to one of history's most audacious political maneuvers as Kenneth MacAlpin, King of the Scots in Dalriada, gazed eastward across the mountains toward the Pictish heartland and saw not an enemy kingdom, but an opportunity that would reshape the map of northern Britain forever. The year was 843, and the stage was set for a unification that would create Scotland. Though whether through cunning diplomacy or ruthless betrayal or remains one of medieval history's great mysteries, the Kenneth who emerges from fragmented chronicles wasn't the noble hero of later legends, but a pragmatic ruler faced with an impossible strategic situation. His kingdom of Dalriada, clinging to Scotland's western seaboard, was under constant pressure from Viking raids that struck without warning from the sea. To the east, the Pictish kingdoms controlled the fertile lands of the Tay and Dee valleys, but were racked by succession disputes that had weakened their military effectiveness. Kenneth's claim to the Pictish throne came through his mother, a princess of the royal Pictish line. In Pictish society, where royal succession followed matrilineal patterns, such claims carried substantial legal weight. But legal claims meant nothing without the military force to back them up, and Kenneth's position in Dalriada was precarious enough that any extended campaign in Pictish territory would leave his own kingdom vulnerable to Norse attack. The solution, when it came, demonstrated the sophisticated political thinking that characterized successful early medieval rulers. Rather than launching costly military campaigns against fortified Pictish strongholds, Kenneth appears to have exploited internal Pictish divisions through a carefully orchestrated series of alliances, marriages, and probably bribes that gradually undermined his opponent's support base. The famous treachery of Scone, mentioned in later chronicles, probably represents a folk memory of whatever final act secured Kenneth's position as ruler of both kingdoms. Whether this involved an actual massacre of Pictish nobles during a supposed peace feast or simply refers metaphorically to political maneuvering that eliminated rival claimants, the result was the same. By 844, Kenneth MacAlpin ruled territories stretching from the Atlantic to the North Sea, creating a unified administration for these diverse territories required governmental innovations that established patterns lasting for centuries. Kenneth couldn't simply impose Gaelic customs on Pictish territories without triggering rebellions, nor could he allow Pictish legal traditions to continue unchanged without undermining his own authority. The compromise solution involved maintaining separate administrative systems while gradually introducing unifying elements. The choice of Scone as the ceremonial center for this new kingdom represented brilliant political symbolism. Located in former Pictish territory, but accessible from Gaelic lands, Scone had ancient associations with royal power that predated either Scottish or Pictish dynasties. The Stone of Destiny, upon which Kenneth was inaugurated, became the physical embodiment of unified Scottish kingship. Kenneth's military reforms reflected the hybrid nature of his kingdom. Gaelic warriors, expert in rapid movement through difficult terrain, were combined with Pictish heavy infantry accustomed to defending fixed positions. The resulting military system proved effective against both Viking raids and English encroachment from the south. Archaeological evidence suggests that weapons production increased dramatically during Kenneth's reign, indicating systematic military modernization. The religious policies Kenneth adopted demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how Christianity could serve as a unifying force. Rather than favoring either Gaelic or Pictish ecclesiastical traditions, he promoted monasteries that served both communities, while encouraging the development of a distinctively Scottish form of Christian worship. The relics of St. Columba were moved from Iona to Dunkeld, creating a new religious centre that symbolized the merger of the two kingdoms. Economic integration proved more challenging than political unification. Gaelic society was primarily pastoral, measuring wealth in cattle and depending on seasonal movements between summer and winter pastures. Pictish communities had developed more intensive agricultural systems suited to their fertile river valleys. Kenneth's solution involved encouraging trade between the two economic systems, while gradually introducing Gaelic pastoral techniques to Pictish territories. The cultural implications of Kenneth's unification were profound and long-lasting. Gaelic language began spreading eastward, eventually displacing Pictish entirely. But this process took centuries and incorporated many Pictish linguistic elements. Pictish artistic traditions influenced Gaelic craftspeople, producing hybrid styles that became distinctively Scottish. Even Pictish legal concepts were incorporated into the emerging Scottish legal system. Kennet's death in 858 didn't trigger the kingdom's collapse that many contemporaries probably expected. His successors, though they faced challenges from Viking raiders, rebellious nobles, and English expansion, maintained the essential unity he had created. The Kingdom of Alba, as it came to be known, had achieved sufficient institutional stability to survive its founder's death. The long-term consequences of Kennet's achievement extended far beyond 8th century politics. By creating a unified Scottish kingdom precisely when Viking Prussia was fragmenting other parts of Britain, he established Scotland's independence at a crucial historical moment. Without Kennet's unification, Scotland might have remained divided into small kingdoms vulnerable to conquest by either Norse or English forces. Kenneth MacAlpin's legacy wasn't the romantic heroism celebrated in later ballads, but something more valuable: the hard-won political unity that allowed Scottish culture to develop its distinctive character. The warrior king's gamble had succeeded, creating a foundation upon which later generations could build the medieval kingdom that would challenge England's attempts at conquest and ultimately survive to become modern Scotland. Envision the Scottish landscape transformed by ambition carved in stone, where every hilltop and strategic river crossing bloomed with towers that pierced the sky like ancient spears thrust upward by the earth itself. The 12th and 13th centuries witnessed an architectural revolution that reshaped not only Scotland's skyline, but its entire social and political structure. As castle building became both symbol and substance of feudal power, the revolution began with Norman influence filtering northward through marriage alliances and political connections rather than conquest. Scottish kings, particularly David I, recognized that Norman military architecture represented a quantum leap in defensive capability. The first castles were earth and timber affairs, motte and bailey structures that could be erected quickly, but demonstrated the new reality of centralized royal power. Edinburgh Castle, perched on its extinct volcanic plug, exemplified the fusion of natural advantage with architectural sophistication. The existing fortifications, probably of ancient origin, were expanded and strengthened using techniques learned from continental masters. The result was an impregnable stronghold that commanded approaches from south and north while serving as a visible reminder of royal authority throughout the central belt. Stirling Castle occupied an even more crucial strategic position, controlling the narrow crossing of the River Forth that represented Scotland's geographic waste. Every army seeking to move between highlands and lowlands had to pass within sight of Stirling's towers. The castle that developed on this site became more than a military installation. It was the key to Scotland's strategic geography, the prize that no ambitious ruler could afford to leave in enemy hands. The technical challenges of castle construction in Scotland required innovations not necessary elsewhere in medieval Europe. Native stone, while abundant, varied dramatically in quality and workability. Highland granite, virtually indestructible once properly quarried and shaped, demanded specialized tools and techniques. Lowland sandstones were easier to work but required careful selection to ensure durability. Through Scotland's harsh weather cycles, master masons, many recruited from France and England, established workshops that became centers of technological innovation. These craftsmen didn't simply reproduce continental designs, but adapted them to Scottish conditions and materials. The distinctive Scottish tower house, with its emphasis on vertical rather than horizontal development, reflected both defensive needs and the practical challenges of building on restricted hilltop sites. The social implications of castle construction were as significant as the military ones. Each castle required not only massive initial investment, but ongoing maintenance by communities of specialized craftspeople, blacksmiths, carpenters, stone carvers, and glaciers clustered around major castles, creating urban centres in previously rural areas. The castle became the nucleus around which medieval Scottish towns developed. Inside these stone shells, life followed patterns that blended military necessity with aristocratic luxury. The Great Hall, typically located on the castle's first floor for security reasons, served multiple functions: dining room for the lord's household, courtroom for legal proceedings, and sleeping accommodation for visitors and retainers. These spaces witnessed the gradual development of Scottish courtly culture. As Highland customs merged with continental fashions, private apartments, usually located in the castle's most secure tower, represented a new concept of domestic privacy that was transforming medieval society. Lords and ladies could retreat from the communal life of the Great Hall to spaces designed for family intimacy and personal reflection. These chambers, often decorated with tapestries and furnished with imported luxuries, demonstrated the castle's role as a centre of cultural as well as political power. The kitchens and service areas that supported castle life were marvels of medieval engineering in their own right. Multiple hearths could simultaneously prepare meals for hundreds of people, while elaborate systems of pulleys and winches moved supplies from storage cellars to upper floors. The scale of these operations required careful planning and sophisticated management that contributed to the development of administrative expertise. Castle chapels served spiritual needs while reinforcing the connection between earthly and divine authority. Many featured elaborate stone carvings and stained glass windows that rivaled those of major churches, demonstrating the Lord's piety while providing impressive settings for important ceremonies. The castle chaplain often served as the Lord's secretary and advisor, adding intellectual resources to military strength. The defensive innovations pioneered in Scottish castles influenced military architecture throughout Northern Europe. Concentric wall systems, where attackers who breached the outer defences found themselves trapped in killing zones overlooked by inner walls, were refined to near perfection in Scottish installations. Arrow loops were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire that left no dead ground where besiegers could find shelter. Siege warfare evolved in response to these architectural developments, becoming increasingly sophisticated and expensive. The great trebuchets and mangonels that appeared during the Wars of Independence could hurl stones weighing several hundredweight over considerable distances, but building and operating these machines required enormous resources. The balance between offensive and defensive technology remained roughly equal throughout the medieval period. The economic impact of castle construction extended far beyond the immediate costs of building and maintenance. Quarries, lime kilns, and transport networks developed to supply construction projects created new economic opportunities throughout rural Scotland. The seasonal nature of building work, concentrated in summer months when weather permitted major construction, established labour migration patterns that brought Highland workers to lowland projects and vice versa. When Scotland's independence was challenged during the Wars of Independence, castles became the focal points around which the entire conflict revolved. Control of key strongholds determined territorial control, making castle siege and defence the primary form of medieval warfare. The legacy of Scotland's castle-building age extends far beyond military history. These stone sentinels established settlement patterns that persist today, created architectural traditions that influenced building techniques for centuries, and demonstrated the resources and organizational capacity that medieval Scotland could marshal when survival demanded innovation. They stand now as monuments to ambition realized in stone, witnesses to the age when Fortress Scotland first learned to think and build like a unified kingdom. Journey beyond Shakespeare's blood-soaked tragedy to encounter the historical Macbeth, a king whose 17-year reign brought stability and prosperity to 11th century Scotland, whose name became synonymous with effective governance rather than murderous ambition, and whose reputation suffered one of history's most complete character assassinations at the hands of political necessity and dramatic convenience. Macbeth Mac Findlay, to give him his proper Gaelic name, inherited the Mormarship of Murray through legitimate succession, not through the supernatural prophecies and guilt-ridden ambition that later dramatists would impose upon his memory. Murray in the 11th century was virtually an independent kingdom, controlling territory that stretched from the Spey to the Pentland Firth, rich in agricultural land and commanding strategic routes between Highland and Lowland Scotland. The political situation that brought Macbeth to the Scottish throne reflected the complex succession laws of medieval Scotland rather than personal villainy. Duncan I, far from being the venerable monarch of Shakespeare's imagination, was a young and inexperienced ruler whose military campaigns had proven disastrously unsuccessful. His invasion of Macbeth's Murray territories in 1040 represented not aggression by a usurper, but legitimate defence by a regional ruler against royal overreach. The Battle of Pitcairn, where Duncan met his death, was fought according to the accepted conventions of medieval warfare. Duncan died with sword in hand, leading his forces against an enemy who had every right to defend his ancestral territories. Macbeth's victory established his claim to the high kingship through conquest, a method of succession that, while violent, was entirely legitimate according to contemporary Scottish legal traditions. The coronation that followed took place at Scone, with all the traditional ceremonies, including the placing of Macbeth upon the Stone of Destiny. This wasn't a hurried usurpation, but a formal assumption of royal authority, witnessed by the leading nobles of the realm. The very fact that Macbeth could secure recognition from the powerful Mormaers and clan chiefs demonstrates that his claim was viewed as legitimate by those who mattered in 11th century Scottish politics. Contemporary chronicles, written closer to the events than Shakespeare's sources, present a remarkably different picture of Macbeth's character and achievements. The Annals of Ulster, generally reliable for Scottish affairs, record no unusual violence or instability during his reign. Instead, they note successful military campaigns against external enemies and evidence of internal peace that allowed trade and agriculture to flourish. The pilgrimage to Rome that Macbeth undertook in 1050, accompanied by his Queen Gruach, represents one of the most remarkable episodes in medieval Scottish royal history. This journey, requiring months of travel through potentially hostile territories, could only have been undertaken by a king confident in his kingdom's stability and his nobles' loyalty. The chronicler who recorded that Macbeth scattered money like seed to the poor in Rome was describing acts of royal piety and generosity, not the behavior of a guilt-ridden tyrant. Macbeth's legal reforms, though less well documented than his military achievements, appear to have strengthened royal authority while respecting regional traditions. The expansion of royal justice into areas previously governed entirely by clan law represented a significant constitutional development that brought Scotland closer to the feudal systems developing elsewhere in Western Europe. These weren't the desperate measures of an insecure usurper, but the confident policies of a king planning for long-term dynastic success. The marriage between Macbeth and Gruach created one of medieval Scotland's most formidable political partnerships. Gruach brought her own claims to royal authority, being the granddaughter of Kenneth III, and her son Lulach from her first marriage provided dynastic continuity that strengthened Macbeth's position. The couple's joint rule lasted 17 years, a remarkable achievement in an era when royal marriages were frequently brief and violent affairs. The military challenges that ultimately ended Macbeth's reign came not from internal Scottish opposition, but from external intervention orchestrated by Edward the Confessor of England, Malcolm Canmore, Duncan's son, had spent years in exile at the English court, gathering support for an invasion that would restore his family's fortunes. The English backing Malcolm received represented a clear attempt to install a more compliant ruler in Scotland. The campaign that began in 1054 with the Battle of Dunsinane wasn't the supernatural fulfillment of witches' prophecies, but a conventional medieval war fought with English support against a legitimate Scottish king. Macbeth's initial success in this campaign, driving the invaders back across the border, demonstrates that he retained substantial support among his subjects even after 14 years of rule. The final defeat at Lumfannin in 1057 ended not just Macbeth's life but one of medieval Scotland's most successful reigns. Malcolm Canmore's victory owed more to English military assistance than to superior legitimacy or popular support. The speed with which Malcolm moved to consolidate power, including the elimination of Macbeth's steps and Lulach within months of the conquest, suggests that he faced ongoing resistance from supporters of the previous regime. The transformation of Macbeth's historical reputation began almost immediately after his death, as the victorious dynasty sought to legitimize their rule by demonizing their predecessors. This process accelerated over the centuries, reaching its culmination in Shakespeare's play, which drew upon chronicles already distorted by centuries of political manipulation and mythological elaboration. Yet the historical evidence, viewed objectively, reveals Macbeth as one of medieval Scotland's most effective rulers. His long reign brought internal peace, successful defense against external threats, and constitutional developments that strengthened royal authority. The usurper's crown, fairly examined, appears to have rested upon a head fully worthy to wear it. Witness the transformation of medieval Scotland, as market squares filled with voices speaking dozen tongues, as silver coins clinked in leather purses, and as ambitious merchants built stone houses that rivaled the towers of ancient nobles. The 12th and 13th centuries brought commercial revolution to a land previously dominated by cattle raids and clan loyalties, fundamentally altering Scottish society in ways that would outlast any political upheaval. The burghs that David I established throughout his kingdom presented more than simple administrative convenience. They were engines of economic transformation, designed to convert Scotland's abundant natural resources into the silver and gold that funded royal ambitions. Each burgh received its charter with carefully defined privileges: the right to hold markets, to mint coins, to trade freely throughout the kingdom, and most importantly, to exclude rural competition from profitable commercial activities. A.St. Andrews, already significant as Scotland's premier religious centre, became the model for successful burgh development. Its merchants, protected by royal charter and papal blessing, established trade networks that stretched from Norway to Flanders. The cathedral that rose there during the 12th century was funded not only by religious donations, but by commercial profits from pilgrims who came to venerate Scotland's patron saint and stayed to purchase locally produced goods. Edinburgh's emergence as Scotland's commercial capital reflected both geographical advantages and shrewd royal policy. Located at the junction of Highland and Lowland Scotland, with easy access to both agricultural regions and overseas markets, Edinburgh attracted merchants from across northern Europe. The weekly markets held in the shadow of the castle became legendary throughout the region for the variety and quality of goods available. The transformation of Aberdeen demonstrates how royal burgh status could revolutionize a settlement's prospects. From a modest fishing village, Aberdeen grew into one of northern Europe's major ports, its merchants trading Scottish wool, hides, and salmon for a Flemish cloth, German silver, and Baltic amber. The wealth generated by this trade funded the construction of St Macha's Cathedral and established Aberdeen as the cultural centre of northeastern Scotland. Glasgow's development followed a different pattern. emerging from religious rather than royal origins. The cathedral established by St. Kentigern became a pilgrimage destination that attracted merchants seeking to profit from religious tourism. The Bishop's Fair, held annually in July, drew traders from throughout Britain and created commercial opportunities that eventually rivaled those of the royal burghs. The wool trade became the foundation of Scotland's international commerce, with Scottish fleeces prized throughout Flanders for their quality and consistency. Cistercian monasteries, particularly those in the border regions, developed sheep farming on an industrial scale that transformed vast areas of previously marginal land into profitable pastoral enterprises. The abbeys of Melrose, Kelso, and Dryburgh became wealthy institutions whose economic influence extended far beyond their religious functions. Merchant families began accumulating wealth that challenged traditional social hierarchies. The Flemings, Germans, and English who settled in Scottish burghs brought continental business practices and international connections that native merchants quickly adopted. Intermarriage between merchant families and minor nobility created new social groups whose loyalties transcended traditional clan boundaries. The technical innovations required for expanded commerce drove developments in multiple crafts. Shipbuilding became increasingly sophisticated as Scottish merchants sought vessels capable of competing with those of established maritime powers. The harbours at Leith, Ayr, and Dumbarton were expanded and improved to accommodate larger ships carrying greater cargo volumes. Banking, in its primitive medieval form, developed to support long-distance trade. Italian merchants established agencies in major Scottish burghs, providing credit facilities and currency exchange services that enabled local merchants to participate in international commerce. The Knights Templar, before their suppression, operated what amounted to an international banking network with Scottish branches. The legal framework supporting commercial development required innovations in Scottish law. Merchant law, derived from international commercial customs, began supplementing traditional clan-based legal systems. Burgh courts gained jurisdiction over commercial disputes, applying principles of contract and property law that were more sophisticated than those used in rural areas. Urban craftsmanship reached new levels of sophistication as burgh markets demanded higher quality goods. Scottish goldsmiths, working with silver from German mines and precious stones from international traders, produced jewelry and religious artifacts that competed successfully with continental products. The guild system, imported from European models, provided both quality control and professional training that elevated craft standards. The social implications of commercial growth were profound and sometimes disturbing to traditional authorities. Successful merchants could purchase land and build houses that rivaled those of established nobility. Their children, educated in burgh schools rather than monastic institutions, developed different values and aspirations than their rural contemporaries. Women participated in commercial life to degrees unusual elsewhere in medieval Europe. Merchant wives often managed businesses during their husbands' trading voyages, while widows frequently continued commercial operations independently. The burgh courts recognized women's property rights more fully than rural legal systems, creating opportunities for female entrepreneurship. The cultural impact of commercial development extended beyond economics into intellectual and artistic realms. Burgh schools, initially established to train clerks for commercial activities, became centers of learning that attracted students from rural areas. The manuscripts, art objects, and architectural innovations funded by merchant wealth contributed significantly to Scotland's cultural development. Religious life in the burghs reflected commercial influences in complex ways. Merchant patronage funded the construction of magnificent parish churches whose architectural sophistication rivaled royal and episcopal foundations. Guild chapels provided spiritual homes for craft associations while reinforcing professional identities that competed with traditional kinship, loyalties. The political consequences of commercial growth would ultimately challenge the feudal structures that had initially enabled burgh development. Wealthy merchants began demanding greater participation in royal government, establishing precedents for urban political influence that would evolve into more democratic forms of representation. The merchant's dream of prosperity through trade was reshaping Scottish society in ways that no royal charter could have anticipated. Since the tremor that ran through Scotland in the year 1296 as Edward Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, crossed the border with the largest English army assembled in living memory, determined to resolve the Scottish succession dispute by transforming Scotland into an English province. What followed was a systematic attempt to destroy Scottish independence that would ultimately forge a national identity stronger than any previous political arrangement. The crisis began with the death of Alexander III in 1286, followed 3 years later by that of his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, leaving Scotland without a clear heir to the throne. The two principal claimants, John Balliol and Robert Bruce, both possessed legitimate genealogical arguments, but neither commanded sufficient support to claim the crown without triggering civil war. In desperation, Scottish nobles invited Edward I to arbitrate their dispute. Edward's decision to support Balliol's claims seemed initially reasonable, but the price he extracted revealed his true intentions. The Scottish king would rule as Edward's vassal, acknowledging English overlordship and agreeing to military service when required. Scotland's independence, maintained successfully against Roman legions and Viking raiders, was bartered away in a legal document signed at Norham Castle. King John, as Balliol became known to his subjects, soon discovered the impossibility of his position. Edward's demands grew increasingly unreasonable, requiring Scottish military service against France and appealing Scottish legal decisions to English courts. When Balliol finally rebelled in 1295, renouncing his homage and forming an alliance with France, Edward's response was swift and merciless. The sack of Berwick demonstrated Edward's ruthless approach to Scottish resistance. Once Scotland's wealthiest trading port, Berwick was transformed into a charnel house as English soldiers massacred civilians without regard to age or gender. Contemporary chroniclers, shocked even by medieval standards of warfare, recorded that the streets ran red with blood 4 days following the town's capture. The Battle of Dunbar completed Scotland's military humiliation. The Scottish army, commanded by nobles more accustomed to ceremonial warfare than serious military operations, collapsed before English heavy cavalry and professional infantry. The flower of Scottish chivalry was captured or killed in a single afternoon, leaving the kingdom defenceless before Edward's advancing forces. Edward's subsequent progress through Scotland resembled a royal progress more than a military campaign. Castle after castle surrendered without resistance. The Stone of Destiny was removed from Scone Abbey and transported to Westminster, where it would remain for 7 centuries as a symbol of English dominance over Scottish monarchy. Every symbol of Scottish independence was systematically destroyed or relocated. The establishment of English administration throughout Scotland appeared to complete the conquest. English officials replaced Scottish administrators, English law superseded Scottish legal traditions, and English soldiers garrisoned every significant fortress. Scotland seemed to have suffered the same fate as Wales, absorbed completely into Edward's expanding Plantagenet dominions. Yet beneath this apparent submission, resistance began almost immediately. The Scottish nobility, who had collaborated with Edward's conquest, soon discovered that their English counterparts viewed them as conquered enemies rather than junior partners. English settlers received preference for offices and land grants, while Scottish nobles found themselves excluded from positions of authority in their own country. Popular resistance took forms that English administrators found impossible to suppress. Travellers disappeared on lonely moors. Supply convoys were attacked by bandits who melted away into familiar landscapes before pursuit could be organised. English garrisons found themselves isolated in hostile territories where every face concealed potential enmity. The spark that ignited organised rebellion came from an unexpected source. William Wallace, a minor Renfrewshire landholder, killed the English sheriff who had insulted his family, then fled to the forests rather than face English justice. His example inspired similar acts of defiance throughout southern Scotland, creating a network of outlaws who gradually coalesced into something resembling a national resistance movement. Wallace's military genius became apparent at Stirling Bridge, where he transformed a tactical disadvantage into stunning victory through patience and superior knowledge of local terrain. By allowing half the English army to cross the narrow bridge before attacking, he created a situation where English numerical superiority became a liability. The flower of Edward's Scottish occupation force died in the marshy ground beside the River Forth, the year of Wallace's guardianship, 1297 to 1298, demonstrated that Scottish independence remained viable despite Edward's conquest. Diplomatic missions to France and Rome secured international recognition for Scotland's cause, while successful raids into northern England recovered much of the wealth English armies had plundered from Scottish towns and monasteries. Edward's personal return to Scotland in 1298 brought overwhelming military force that no Scottish army could match in open battle. At Falkirk, Wallace's tactics that had succeeded at Stirling Bridge proved inadequate against English longbowmen supported by heavy cavalry. The Scottish army was destroyed, and Wallace was forced to resume guerrilla warfare from forest hideouts. The capture and execution of Wallace in 1305 was intended to demonstrate the futility of resistance to English rule, but instead created a martyr whose memory would inspire Scottish patriots for centuries. Edward's brutal public execution, with its ritual humiliation and dismemberment, shocked even his English supporters and confirmed Scottish beliefs about English barbarism and cruelty. The resumption of rebellion under Robert Bruce in 1306 proved that Wallace's sacrifice had achieved its ultimate purpose. The hammer had fallen on Scotland with devastating force, but the anvil had not broken. Instead, it had been transformed into something harder and more resilient than before. Scottish national identity, forged in the fires of conquest and resistance, would prove stronger than any English hammer could shatter. Edward's attempt to destroy Scottish independence had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. By treating Scots as a conquered people rather than fellow subjects, by systematically humiliating Scottish institutions and customs, and by responding to resistance with exemplary brutality, Edward had created the very national consciousness that would ultimately defeat his imperial ambitions. Enter the cave where legend places Robert the Bruce during the darkest hour of his struggle for Scotland's throne, watching a spider weave its web with the persistence that would become his own watchword. Whether this famous story represents literal truth or symbolic wisdom, it captures perfectly the character of a man who transformed repeated defeat into ultimate victory through patience, cunning, and an understanding of power that went far deeper than mere military prowess. Robert Bruce's path to the Scottish throne began not with noble purpose, but with naked ambition and shocking violence. His murder of John Comyn before the altar of Dumfries Cathedral in February 1306 violated every sacred principle of medieval society, earning him excommunication from the Pope and condemnation from English and Scottish alike. Yet this desperate act also freed him from political constraints that had previously limited his options. The coronation that followed at Scone was a pathetic affair compared to traditional Scottish royal ceremonies, with most of the Scottish nobility either dead, exiled, or allied with England. Bruce's supporters could muster only a handful of bishops and minor nobles to witness his assumption of the crown. The ceremony itself had to be conducted hurriedly, using a makeshift circlet since Edward I had removed the traditional crown jewels to England. Edward's response was characteristically brutal, but also strategically intelligent. Rather than simply sending another army to crush this latest Scottish rebellion, he systematically targeted Bruce's supporters and family members. Bruce's wife, daughter, and sisters were imprisoned in harsh conditions, designed to break their spirits and discourage further resistance. His brothers were hunted down and executed with public displays of cruelty intended as warnings to other potential rebels. The campaign of 1306 to 1307 reduced Bruce to the status of a fugitive in his own kingdom. English forces, supported by Scottish collaborators who viewed Bruce as a sacrilegious murderer, drove him from stronghold to stronghold across western Scotland. His army, such as it was, melted away as defeat followed defeat. By winter, Bruce commanded fewer than 300 men and controlled no territory larger than the area his band could physically occupy. The transformation began with Edward I's death in July 1307, removing Scotland's most formidable enemy and replacing him with Edward II, whose military incompetence and political weakness would prove crucial to Bruce's ultimate success. The new English king inherited his father's Scottish policy, but lacked both the strategic vision and personal ruthlessness necessary to implement it. Effectively, Bruce's guerrilla warfare tactics during the following years established patterns that would influence irregular warfare for centuries, rather than attempting to hold fixed positions that English armies could besiege and capture. He adopted a strategy of constant movement that used Scotland's difficult terrain to neutralize English advantages in numbers and equipment. His forces struck suddenly at isolated garrisons, then vanished into landscapes they knew intimately, but their enemies found bewildering. The systematic destruction of Scottish castles that Bruce ordered represented one of history's most counterintuitive military strategies. Rather than using these fortifications as bases for his own operations, Bruce recognized that they would inevitably fall back into English hands and serve as platforms for renewed conquest. By demolishing Scotland's castles, he denied his enemies the strongholds necessary for permanent occupation, while forcing them to rely on long and vulnerable supply lines. The recapture of Perth in January 1313 demonstrated Bruce's evolution from desperate fugitive to sophisticated military commander. The assault, conducted during a freezing winter night, with Bruce personally leading his men through the town's water-filled moat, succeeded through careful planning and intimate knowledge of the target's weaknesses. More importantly, it established Bruce's reputation for a personal courage that attracted supporters who might otherwise have remained neutral. Douglas Castle's capture and destruction became legendary throughout Scotland, inspiring the ballad that celebrated the Douglas larder and James Douglas's reputations, the Black Douglas feared by English garrisons throughout southern Scotland. These exploits served propaganda purposes as important as their military objectives, demonstrating that English occupation forces were vulnerable despite their apparent strength. The siege of Stirling Castle created the circumstances that would lead to Bannockburn, as Edward Bruce's rash promise to lift the siege, if not relieved by midsummer 1314, forced his brother into the open battle he had successfully avoided for 7 years. Robert Bruce understood the enormous risks involved in confronting Edward II's massive army on relatively open ground, but political necessity left him no choice if he hoped to maintain credibility with his supporters. The preliminary skirmish on June 23, 1314, when Bruce killed Henry de Bohun in single combat before the assembled armies of both sides, demonstrated the psychological warfare that was as important as tactical brilliance in medieval conflicts. Bruce's victory over the English knight, achieved through superior horsemanship and weapon skills, rather than mere luck, provided a morale boost to Scottish forces while simultaneously undermining English confidence. The Battle of Bannockburn itself represented the culmination of Bruce's military education, combining the guerrilla tactics he had mastered during his years as a fugitive with the conventional warfare necessary to defeat a major English army. His use of terrain to neutralize English cavalry advantages, his deployment of disciplined spear formations that could withstand heavy cavalry charges, and his timing of the decisive attack all demonstrated strategic thinking of the highest order. The political consequences of Bannockburn extended far beyond military victory. European recognition of Scottish independence followed naturally from Bruce's demonstration that his kingdom could defeat English attempts at conquest. The Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, with its stirring assertion that Scots would choose death before subjugation, represented the international diplomatic triumph that secured Scotland's place among the recognised kingdoms of Christendom. Bruce's final years were devoted to the consolidation of his achievements through institutional reforms that would outlast his own lifetime. The Parliament he established, the legal system he reformed, and the administrative structures he created provided Scotland with governmental capacity that could function effectively even during royal minorities or disputed successions. The Spider King's web had been completed strand by strand, defeat by defeat, small victory by small victory, until it became strong enough to entrap the might of Plantagenet England. Bruce's legacy wasn't just Scottish independence, but a demonstration that patience, persistence, and strategic thinking could overcome seemingly insurmountable disadvantages. Ride through the mist-shrouded valleys where the borders of Scotland and England blurred into a twilight zone of shifting loyalties, family feuds, and cattle raids that transformed survival into an art form. The border reivers, active from the 13th through the 17th centuries, created a unique culture where theft was honor, revenge was duty, and the line between outlaw and gentleman depended entirely on which side of the raid you found yourself. The geography of the Anglo-Scottish border created the conditions that produced this extraordinary society. Neither fully Scottish nor English, the border regions existed in a state of permanent uncertainty where royal authority from Edinburgh or London arrived weekly if at all. In this power vacuum, local families developed their own systems of justice, defense, and economic survival that owed little to either kingdom's legal traditions. The great reiving families, Armstrongs, Elliots, Johnstons, Grahams, and their countless branches, built their reputations on their ability to strike swiftly and vanish completely into landscapes they knew better than any pursuing authority. Their towers, squat stone structures built more for defense than comfort, dotted the border hills like medieval early warning systems, each one a fortress capable of withstanding brief sieges, while its owners escaped through hidden passages or simply outlasted their attackers. Reiving operated according to complex codes that distinguished it from simple brigandage. Raids were typically conducted against families with whom the raiders had specific grievances, often stretching back generations through cycles of revenge and counter-revenge. A successful reiver earned respect not just for the cattle he stole, but for the skill with which he conducted his operations and the style with which he evaded pursuit. The border ballads that preserve the culture's memory celebrate exploits that sound more like adventures from romance literature than criminal activities. Kinmont Willie describes a daring rescue from Carlisle Castle that involved international diplomatic incidents. The lament of the border widow captures the grief of families torn apart by the violent life their culture demanded. These weren't simple songs, but historical records of a society that valued honor above law. The light cavalry tactics that borderers developed influenced military thinking throughout northern Europe. Their horses, bred for speed and stamina rather than strength, could cover enormous distances rapidly while carrying riders trained from childhood in mounted combat. The border lance, lighter than conventional heavy cavalry weapons, but deadly in skilled hands, became the preferred weapon of men who might need to fight their way out of any situation. The sexual politics of border society reflected its violent realities in complex ways. Women of reaving families were expected to contribute to their family's survival through intelligence gathering, message carrying, and sometimes direct participation in raids. The riding women who accompanied some expeditions were skilled horsewomen and fighters whose courage was celebrated in ballad and story. The justice system that emerged in the borders represented a fascinating hybrid of Scottish, English, and purely local traditions. March law, administered by wardens appointed by both kingdoms, attempted to regulate cross-border disputes through formal procedures, but these official mechanisms competed with traditional clan justice and personal revenge. The result was a legal maze where the same acts might be simultaneously legal, illegal, and required depending on which authority was consulted. The peculiar institution of hot rod allowed victims of raids to pursue thieves across national boundaries for a limited time, provided they carried fire on a spear point and announced their pursuit with horn calls. This legal fiction allowed both kingdoms to maintain the pretense of controlling border lawlessness, while acknowledging the practical impossibility of enforcing conventional justice in such circumstances. Blackmail, in its original border sense, wasn't extortion, but a protection racket where powerful families guaranteed their neighbors' safety in exchange for regular payments of money or goods. Families who paid their blackmail, as opposed to the white mail of legitimate rent, could expect protection from raids, while those who refused became legitimate targets for reaving expeditions. The religious life of border society reflected its anomalous legal status. Many borderers attended church regularly and considered themselves devout Christians, but they also maintained that reaving wasn't sinful provided it was conducted according to proper customs. Ministers who preached against raiding often found their own cattle mysteriously disappearing, while those who blessed reaving expeditions enjoyed their congregation's generous support. The end of reaving came not through military suppression, but through political change. The Union of Crowns in 1603 eliminated the border as a meaningful boundary, while James VI and I's systematic campaign against the reaving families destroyed their power base. The king's policy of transplanting entire families to Ireland or the American colonies broke up the kinship networks that had sustained border culture for centuries. The cultural legacy of the border reavers extends far beyond their historical period. The surnames they carried, Armstrong, Elliot, Graham, and dozens of others, spread throughout the English-speaking world through emigration. Their ballads influenced romantic poetry and continue to inspire folk musicians. Their horsemanship traditions contributed to the development of American frontier culture, where many border emigrants settled. Modern borders tourism celebrates a romanticized version of reaving culture that emphasizes adventure, while downplaying the violence and suffering that characterized the reality. The stone towers that served as reaver strongholds now house museums and holiday accommodations, their martial purposes transformed into picturesque historical curiosities. Yet the essential reality of border reaving remains historically significant as an example of how communities can develop stable social systems outside formal state control. The borderers' achievement wasn't lawlessness, but the creation of alternative laws that serve their survival needs better than the official legal systems of either Scotland or England. Follow the remarkable ascent of a family whose very name proclaimed their service to Scottish royalty, yet who would ultimately wear the crown they had once helped others bear. The Stuart dynasties' rise from hereditary administrators to royal rulers represents one of medieval Europe's most extraordinary examples of patient ambition rewarded by historical circumstance and political skill that transformed servants into sovereigns. Walter Fitzalan, the family's Scottish founder, arrived from Shropshire in the early 12th century as part of David I's programme to strengthen royal administration through imported expertise. Appointed High Steward of Scotland, Walter received substantial land grants in Renfrewshire and Ayrshire as payment for his services, establishing the territorial base that would sustain his descendants' rising influence over the following 2 centuries. The office of High Steward evolved from simple household management into one of Scotland's most powerful political positions. The steward controlled royal finances, supervised the collection of taxes and feudal obligations, and managed the complex logistics of royal progresses that carried the king and his court throughout the kingdom. This administrative role provided intimate knowledge of Scotland's resources and political networks that would prove invaluable to later Stuart ambitions. The Stuart family's marriage strategy demonstrated sophisticated understanding of medieval political dynamics. Rather than seeking immediate social advancement through matches with established noble families, they consistently married into minor but strategically important bloodlines, gradually accumulating genealogical claims and territorial connections that enhanced their long-term prospects while avoiding the jealousy that spectacular marriages might have provoked. Robert the Stuart's path to the throne began with his mother's marriage to Robert the Bruce's son David, making him heir presumptive when David II died childless in 1371. Yet this succession, seemingly inevitable in retrospect, represented the culmination of careful political maneuvering that had positioned the Stuart family to benefit from demographic accidents that eliminated other potential claimants. The early Stuart kings faced significant challenges in establishing their legitimacy and authority. Robert II, already elderly when he gained the throne, struggled with rebellious sons and fractious nobles who questioned his ability to maintain royal authority. His reign, while peaceful, was marked by gradual erosion of central power as regional magnates asserted increasing independence from royal control. Robert III's physical disability, resulting from a kick by a horse, created a power vacuum that his brother Robert, Duke of Albany, was quick to fill. The mysterious death of the king's eldest son David, Duke of Rothesay, while in Albany's custody, generated suspicions that would haunt Scottish politics for decades and demonstrated the violent realities that underlay medieval court politics. James I's long imprisonment in England paradoxically strengthened rather than weakened the Stuart dynasty's ultimate position. During his captivity, he received an education in English, governmental techniques, and continental political theory that equipped him to modernize Scottish administration when he finally returned to claim his throne in 1424. The assassination of James I in 1437 at Blackfriars Monastery in Perth revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of Stuart rule. The conspiracy that killed him drew support from nobles who resented his attempts to strengthen royal authority. Yet the swift capture and brutal execution of the conspirators demonstrated that the dynasty had developed sufficient institutional support to survive even the violent death of its head. James II's minority witnessed the emergence of the Douglas family as rivals to Stuart power, culminating in the Black Dinner of 1440, when the young 6th Earl of Douglas and his brother were treacherously murdered during a feast at Edinburgh Castle. This incident, orchestrated by royal advisors, eliminated the most dangerous threat to Stuart authority, but at the cost of establishing precedents for political violence that would plague Scotland for generations. The personal rule of James II demonstrated the Stuart capacity for ruthless political calculation disguised as royal justice. His murder of the 8th Earl of Douglas during a dinner at Stirling Castle in 1452, committed with his own hands after offering the Earl safe conduct, shocked contemporary observers, but effectively ended Douglas' power as a threat to royal authority. James III's reign illustrated the continuing challenges facing Stuart kings who sought to strengthen royal power against entrenched noble interests. His preference for low-born advisors and continental cultural influences alienated traditional supporters, while his military failures against English forces undermined confidence in his leadership capabilities. The tragedy at Sautulburn in 1488, where James III died fleeing from a battlefield where his own nobles had rebelled against him, marked the nadir of early Stuart fortunes. Yet even this disaster couldn't destroy the dynasty, as James IV inherited a throne that, despite its immediate problems, rested on increasingly solid institutional foundations. James IV's reign represented the Stuart dynasty's coming-of-age European royalty. His court at Holyrood Palace rivaled those of England and France in its cultural sophistication, while his diplomatic marriages and military alliances demonstrated Scotland's recognition as a significant European power rather than merely England's troublesome northern neighbour. The disaster at Flodden in 1513, where James IV became the last British monarch to die in battle, tested but did not break Stuart resilience. The Regency government that ruled during James V's minority maintained dynastic continuity while demonstrating that Scottish governmental institutions had developed sufficient sophistication to function effectively. Even during royal minorities, the Stuart transformation from servants to sovereigns reflected broader changes in medieval political culture that elevated administrative competence above traditional martial virtues. Their success demonstrated that patient accumulation of expertise, territorial resources, and genealogical connections could prove more valuable than dramatic military achievements or spectacular political gestures. The dynasty that began with a Shropshire administrator's appointment to a household office had created a European monarchy that would ultimately unite the English and Scottish crowns under a single ruler. The servants had indeed become kings, but more importantly, they had transformed the very nature of Scottish kingship in the process. Behold the flowering of Scottish intellectual and artistic achievement during the 15th and 16th centuries, when courts at Stirling and Edinburgh rivaled those of Renaissance Italy in their patronage of learning, when Scottish poets composed verses that echoed across Europe, and when stonemasons created architectural marvels that still inspire wonder centuries after their completion. The cultural transformation began with the return of James I from English captivity, bringing with him exposure to humanist learning and continental artistic traditions that would profoundly influence Scottish intellectual development. His own poetry, particularly the Kingisquire, demonstrated that Scottish literature could achieve sophisticated artistic effects while maintaining distinctively national characteristics. The foundation of universities at St Andrews, Glasgow, and Aberdeen during the 15th century established Scotland as a centre of learning that attracted students from across Northern Europe. These institutions, modelled on continental universities but adapted to Scottish conditions, produced generations of scholars whose intellectual achievements rivaled those of more established European centres of learning. Scottish poetry during this period achieved international recognition through the works of Robert Henryson, William Dunbar, and Gavin Douglas. These poets, writing in Scots rather than Latin, demonstrated that vernacular literature could achieve effects previously associated only with classical languages. Their works combined sophisticated literary techniques with distinctively Scottish sensibilities, creating a national literature that was both locally rooted and universally appealing. The architectural achievements of the period reflected both increased prosperity and sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. Stirling Castle's Great Hall, built during James IV's reign, represented one of Northern Europe's finest examples of late medieval secular architecture. Its soaring timber roof, supported by innovative engineering techniques, created interior spaces that rivaled the greatest continental palaces in their grandeur and sophistication. Scottish stone carving reached unprecedented levels of artistic achievement during the Renaissance period. The monuments in Rosslyn Chapel, with their intricate symbolic programs and technical virtuosity, demonstrated mastery of sculptural techniques that had previously been associated only with Italian workshops. These works represented not mere imitation of continental styles, but creative adaptation that produced distinctively Scottish artistic expressions. The development of printing in Scotland, beginning with the establishment of Andrew Miller's Press in Edinburgh around 1507, revolutionized the distribution of learning and literature throughout the kingdom. Scottish printers, working with limited resources but considerable ingenuity, produced books that competed successfully with continental publications, while making literature accessible to broader audiences than had previously been possible. Music flourished in Scottish courts and churches, with composers creating works that blended traditional Scottish musical elements with continental polyphonic techniques. The surviving manuscripts from this period reveal sophisticated understanding of musical theory, combined with sensitivity to distinctively Scottish melodic and rhythmic patterns that would influence musical development for centuries. Scientific learning, while less developed than in some continental centres, nevertheless produced significant achievements. Scottish scholars made contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy that earned recognition throughout Europe. Their work often combined theoretical learning with practical applications suited to Scottish conditions and needs. The visual arts experienced dramatic development as Scottish artists mastered techniques of oil painting and panel painting that had been developed in Flanders and Italy. Portrait paintings from this period reveal not only technical competence but psychological insight that places Scottish artists among the finest practitioners of their era. Tapestry, weaving and textile arts achieved new levels of sophistication as Scottish workshops learned continental techniques while maintaining traditional Celtic decorative motifs. The resulting works combined technical excellence with distinctive national characteristics that made Scottish textiles prized throughout Northern Europe. The patronage system that supported this cultural flowering involved not only royal courts but also wealthy merchants, church officials, and regional magnates who competed to demonstrate their sophistication through support of artistic and intellectual endeavors. This broad-based patronage ensured that cultural development wasn't dependent solely on royal favor, but drew support from multiple sources throughout Scottish society. The northern lights of Scottish culture illuminated a society that was simultaneously deeply rooted in its own traditions and eagerly receptive to international influences. This cultural renaissance established Scotland as a significant participant in European intellectual and artistic life, creating achievements that would influence national development long after the political circumstances that enabled them had passed. Step into the chambers of Linlithgow Palace on a December morning in 1542, where a 6-day-old infant has just inherited one of Europe's most troubled thrones, unaware that her life will unfold as a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, combining political intrigue with personal passion in ways that would fascinate and horrify observers for centuries to come. Mary Stuart's childhood exile in France shaped her into a figure who embodied the tensions between Scotland's medieval traditions and Renaissance aspirations. Raised in the sophisticated court of Henry II, She received an education that equipped her with multiple languages, refined cultural sensibilities, and political theories that bore little relation to the harsh realities of 16th century Scottish governance. The young Queen's marriage to the French Dauphin Francis represented the culmination of the old alliance between Scotland and France, briefly making her Queen of France as well as Scotland when Francis inherited his father's throne in 1559. For a moment, it seemed that Scotland might become a province of an expanded French Empire, but Francis's sudden death in 1560 left Mary a widow at 18, forced to choose between remaining in France as a dowager queen or returning to claim her Scottish inheritance. Her decision to return to Scotland in 1561 brought a cultured, Catholic, French-educated queen back to a kingdom that had undergone Protestant Reformation during her absence. The Scotland Mary encountered was dramatically different from the one she had left as a child, austere in its religious practices, suspicious of foreign influence, and dominated by nobles who had gained power and wealth through their support of religious reform. The early years of Mary's personal rule demonstrated considerable political skill as she navigated between Catholic and Protestant factions while maintaining Scotland's independence from both French and English interference. Her marriage to Lord Darnley in 1565, while satisfying Scottish preferences for a domestic match, introduced complications that would ultimately destroy her reign and reputation. Darnley's character defects became apparent almost immediately after the marriage. Handsome and well-connected, but also arrogant, violent, and possibly mentally unstable, he quickly alienated Mary and her advisors through his demands for greater political authority and his association with the most reactionary elements of Scottish politics. His participation in the brutal murder of David Rizzio, Mary's secretary, while she was pregnant, demonstrated a capacity for violence that made him dangerous to everyone around him. The mysterious circumstances surrounding Darnley's death at Kirkhoe Field in February 1567 created a scandal that would haunt Mary for the remainder of her life. Whether she was complicit in the plot that killed her husband, whether she was coerced into marriage with the suspected murderer James Hepburn, Earl of Bathwell, or whether she was the victim of circumstances beyond her control remains debated by historians, but the political consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The marriage to Bathwell, conducted according to Protestant rites, despite Mary's Catholic faith, alienated supporters across the religious spectrum, while providing her enemies with evidence of moral corruption that justified armed rebellion. The Confederate lords who rose against her claimed to be rescuing Scotland from a queen who had forfeited her right to rule through adultery and murder. Mary's defeat at the Battle of Carberry Hill represented not just military failure, but the collapse of the entire political coalition that had sustained her rule. Abandoned by supporters who found her association with Bothwell impossible to defend, she was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son James VI, while submitting to imprisonment in the island fortress of Lochleven Castle. The dramatic escape from Lochleven in May 1568, orchestrated by loyal supporters who risked everything to free their queen, briefly offered hope for Mary's restoration, but her defeat at the Battle of Langside by forces commanded by her half-brother James Stuart, Earl of Murray, ended any possibility of recovering her throne through military action. Mary's flight to England, seeking the protection of her cousin Elizabeth I, represented a final miscalculation that transformed her from a deposed queen into a dangerous problem that English politics could neither solve nor ignore. Her presence on English soil provided a rallying point for Catholic opposition to Elizabeth's Protestant regime, while creating diplomatic complications that affected England's relations with both France and Spain. The 18 years of Mary's captivity in England revealed both her resilience and her ultimate political naivety. Despite comfortable accommodations and considerable personal freedom, she never accepted the reality of her situation, continuing to correspond with foreign powers and English Catholics in ways that ultimately provided her enemies with evidence of treasonable activities. The Babington Plot of 1586, whether Mary was an active participant or merely an unwitting victim of entrapment by English intelligence agents, provided Elizabeth's government with the legal justification it needed to resolve the problem Mary's existence represented. The trial that followed was arguably a judicial murder, but it was conducted according to English law and with sufficient legal formality to satisfy most contemporary observers. Mary's execution at Fotheringay Castle of February 8, 1587, was choreographed as a demonstration of Elizabeth's justice, but it achieved the opposite effect, creating a martyr whose death inspired Catholic resistance throughout Europe. Her dignity in facing death, her forgiveness of her executioners, and her final prayers in Latin created a powerful contrast to the political machinations that had brought her to the scaffold. The irony of Mary's tragic life lay in its ultimate political consequences. Her son James VI, raised as a Protestant and trained in the political realities she had never mastered, would inherit both the Scottish throne she had lost and the English throne that had condemned her to death. The union of crowns that Mary had dreamed of achieving through diplomatic marriage was ultimately accomplished by the son she had barely known. Mary, Queen of Scots, remains one of history's most controversial figures precisely because her story resists simple interpretation. Whether she was the victim of circumstances beyond her control or the author of her own destruction, whether her sufferings were deserved punishment for serious crimes or martyrdom for political principles, her tragedy continues to fascinate because it embodies the eternal conflict between personal desire and political necessity. Witness the moment on March 24, 1603, when a messenger arrived at Holyrood Palace carrying news that would transform the political landscape of the British Isles forever. Elizabeth I was dead, and James VI of Scotland had inherited the English throne, uniting under a single ruler two kingdoms that had spent centuries locked in bitter conflict and mutual suspicion. The succession that elevated James to the English throne represented the culmination of dynastic policies that had been developing for over a century. His claim derived from his great-grandmother Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, whose marriage to James IV had been intended to create lasting peace between Scotland and England, but had instead produced complex genealogical entanglements that would ultimately reshape British politics. James's journey south from Edinburgh to London in April 1603 resembled a royal progress, more than a simple change of residence, as English nobles who had previously viewed Scotland as a barbarous northern kingdom competed to demonstrate their loyalty to the new monarch. The transformation in English attitudes towards Scotland was immediate and dramatic, though often superficial and temporary. The practical challenges of governing two separate kingdoms with different legal systems, religious establishments, and political traditions quickly became apparent to James and his advisors. Despite his vision of creating the unified Great Britain, both English and Scottish parliaments resisted proposals for constitutional union that would have merged their separate institutions into a single governmental system. The resistance to political union reflected deep-seated cultural differences and mutual prejudices that centuries of warfare had embedded in both national consciousnesses. English politicians feared that union would dilute England's wealth and power by sharing them with a smaller, poorer northern neighbour, while Scottish nobles worried that their kingdom would be absorbed into a larger English state and lose its distinctive identity. Economic integration proceeded more smoothly than political union, as the removal of trade barriers between the kingdoms created new opportunities for merchants on both sides of the former border. Scottish cattle, coal, and textiles found expanded markets in England, while English manufactured goods and colonial products became more readily available in Scottish towns and cities. The religious complications of the union were particularly complex, as James found himself simultaneously head of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland and the Episcopal Church of England, two religious systems with fundamentally different theological principles and organizational structures. His attempts to harmonize these differences satisfied neither Scottish Presbyterians nor English Anglicans, as James's financial problems were exacerbated rather than solved by his accession to the English throne, as the costs of maintaining to royal households, to administrative systems, and expanded diplomatic obligations outweighed the increased revenues available to him. His constant requests for parliamentary subsidies created tensions with both English and Scottish legislative bodies. The cultural influence of the Union flowed in both directions, as Scottish courtiers brought Highland customs and Gaelic traditions to the English court, while English legal and administrative practices gradually influenced Scottish governmental procedures. This cultural exchange mixed both traditions, while creating hybrid forms that were distinctively British rather than purely English or Scottish. The security implications of the Union were profound, as the removal of the Anglo-Scottish border as a potential military frontier allowed both kingdoms to redirect resources previously devoted to mutual defense toward overseas expansion and colonial development. The Union indirectly facilitated the development of British imperial power by eliminating a major source of internal conflict. James's vision of Great Britain extended beyond mere political union to encompass shared cultural and religious identity that would transcend traditional national boundaries. His promotion of the English Bible, his patronage of literature that celebrated British rather than purely English or Scottish themes, and his diplomatic policies that emphasized British rather than separate national interests all reflected this broader vision. The resistance to James's unionist policies came not only from parliamentary opposition, but also from popular sentiment that valued national distinctiveness above the practical benefits that union might provide. Riots in London protested the supposed Scottish invasion of English institutions, while Scottish Kirk ministers denounced the corrupting influence of English religious practices. The legacy of the Union of Crowns extended far beyond James's reign, establishing precedents and creating institutions that would ultimately lead to the Act of Union in 1707. The experience of shared monarchy demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of Anglo-Scottish cooperation, while highlighting the deep-seated differences that would continue to complicate British politics for centuries. The development of a distinctively British literary culture began during James's reign, as writers in both kingdoms began to imagine audiences that transcended traditional national boundaries. The King James Bible, Shakespeare's Scottish plays, and the poetry of Anglo-Scottish courtiers all reflected this emerging British consciousness while maintaining distinctively national characteristics. The Union's impact on Scotland was particularly significant, as the kingdom's political elite gradually became integrated into British rather than purely Scottish networks of power and patronage. This development strengthened Scotland's international position while potentially undermining the distinctive institutions and traditions that had sustained Scottish independence for centuries. James's death in 1625 passed the Union to his son Charles I, whose attempts to impose religious and political uniformity on both kingdoms would ultimately trigger the conflicts that led to civil war, regicide, and temporary dissolution of the monarchical union. Yet the basic structure James had created proved resilient enough to survive these upheavals and ultimately evolve into the permanent union that created modern Britain. The Union of Crowns represented a peaceful resolution to centuries of Anglo-Scottish conflict, achieved through dynastic accident rather than military conquest or negotiated settlement. Its success in ending border warfare while preserving Scottish institutional identity provided a model for later political arrangements that would shape the development of the British state and its imperial expansion throughout the world. Stand now among the ruins that dot the Scottish landscape, enduring memories carved in stone, where centuries of struggle, ambition, and achievement have left their marks on a land that shaped and was shaped by the people who called it home. The medieval Scotland we have journeyed through continues to live in these monuments, in the stories passed down through generations, and in the very character of the nation that emerged from those turbulent centuries. The castles that still crown Scottish hilltops remain eloquent witnesses to the age when stone walls meant survival, when the height of a tower measured a family's power, and when the strength of fortifications could determine the fate of kingdoms. Edinburgh Castle, Stirling's ancient ramparts, and countless tower houses scattered through the Highlands and Lowlands continue to speak of times when every settlement needed defenders, and every valley might hide enemies or friends. The battlefields where Scottish independence was won and lost have returned to peaceful purposes, their violent histories marked by simple monuments that seem insufficient for the magnitude of events they commemorate. Yet in these quiet fields, the echoes of Bannockburn and Flodden still whisper to those who know how to listen, reminding us that freedom and nationhood are never permanent achievements, but must be renewed by each generation. The churches and abbeys that brought Christianity to pagan Scotland, many now roofless ruins open to the sky, nevertheless retain their spiritual power to move visitors who walk among their broken stones. Iona's ancient burial ground, Melrose Abbey's delicate tracery, and countless parish churches, still functioning after centuries of service, demonstrate how faith shaped Scottish society as profoundly as warfare or politics. The royal bloodlines we have followed through triumph and tragedy eventually spread far beyond Scotland's borders, carrying Scottish heritage to kingdoms and colonies throughout the world. The Stuart dynasty's descendants ruled not only Scotland and England, but influenced political development across Europe and the Americas, ensuring that Scottish medieval traditions would help shape the modern world. The cultural achievements of medieval Scotland, its literature, art, architecture, and law, established foundations that continue to influence Scottish identity today. The poetry of medieval Scottish writers still inspires contemporary authors. The legal principles developed in medieval Scottish courts still influence modern jurisprudence, and the architectural traditions established in medieval times still shape how Scots build and inhabit their spaces. The clan system that dominated Highland society for centuries has evolved rather than disappeared, maintaining its emphasis on family loyalty and territorial connection while adapting to modern political and economic realities. Highland games, tartan traditions, and genealogical research that connects modern Scots to medieval ancestors all demonstrate the persistence of social structures that seem destined for extinction. The languages of medieval Scotland, Gaelic, Scots, and Latin, survive in various forms, preserving not only vocabulary and grammar, but entire ways of understanding and describing the world. Place names throughout Scotland continue to carry medieval meanings, connecting contemporary residents to landscapes that their ancestors knew by the same words. Even when the languages that created those words are no longer widely spoken, the agricultural techniques, building methods, and craft traditions developed during Scotland's medieval period influenced rural life for centuries after the medieval period officially ended. Stone walls built according to medieval techniques still separate Highland fields, Traditional Highland dress preserves medieval textile traditions, and Scottish cooking methods maintain connections to medieval culinary practices. The political institutions that emerged from medieval Scotland, particularly the concepts of limited monarchy, parliamentary representation, and individual rights that developed through centuries of struggle between kings and nobles, contributed significantly to the democratic traditions that Scotland shared with the wider world through emigration and cultural influence. The stories themselves, passed down through oral tradition and written chronicles, continue to shape how Scots understand their past and imagine their future. The legends of Robert the Bruce, William Wallace, and Mary Queen of Scots remain powerful cultural symbols that influence contemporary Scottish politics and identity, demonstrating the enduring power of historical narrative to shape national consciousness. Medieval Scotland's greatest legacy may be its demonstration that small nations can maintain their independence and distinctive character even when surrounded by larger, more powerful neighbours. The survival strategies developed during centuries of English pressure provided templates that influenced independence movements throughout the world, while Scotland's success in preserving its identity while adapting to changing circumstances offers lessons relevant to contemporary political challenges. As we conclude our journey through medieval Scotland, we leave behind not just a historical period, but a living tradition that continues to evolve while maintaining connections to its ancient roots. The Scotland that emerged from its medieval centuries was transformed, but not destroyed, strengthened rather than weakened by the trials it had endured, ready to face the modern world while carrying forward the wisdom and resilience that its medieval experiences had taught. The stones may crumble and the stories may fade, but the spirit forged in medieval Scotland's crucible of conflict and achievement continues to burn bright, illuminating paths forward while honouring the ancestors who made the journey possible through their courage, determination, and unshakable belief that their homeland was worth defending at any cost.